Thank you, Mr. Isaacson. That was, I think, brilliant the way so fluidly took us along the journey to the final 13th August breakthrough moment. And I think all of us share this positive reverberation that you think is going to happen in the region. I mean, you, of course, raised your concerns about some pockets, but I think overall you think that's going to be, I don't follow Middle East too closely, but it was, I think, 98. That was the only visit that I was in Jerusalem over a refugee conference, actually. And I spent 5 days there. And, Indian by nature, we are kind of, there's an orientation that we tend to move with the Gulf states and, kind of a thing. But because I had a lot of friends from the New York University as well as DC, I was also in my spare time and even during the conference. I mean, I had about 3 presentations and they made me stay back for 2 more days for some other interaction that we were doing on that particular council that I was on. And I remember how, while a lot of my friends, and I remember a Kuwaiti gentleman as well as somebody from Jordan, I think, who took me to the Al-Aqsa Mosque and took me to all the old walls, the cities, and the Wailing Wall and all of that. While again, the other friends took me to this other part, which is for me at that time resembled more of Germany than anything else. The other nicer side of it. But there was a very stony, cold Indian point at that point of time. I mean, we knew the relationships were there, but it was always, tacit, and there was never any recognition officially, of course. Subsequently, and I think my whole exposure to this region is thanks with Kumar. I mean, my association with him for the over last 2 decades and having watched MEI very closely, I though don't really research or study this area, but I've had a certain amount of ideas from his writing and work. There's obviously the last 5-6 years there's been India's looked at things differently. I think Prime Minister Modi has kind of, so I mean a lot of questions come here, and what I recall that stony thing that we earlier had. And I also remember I used to be with IDSS, we used to have a lot of delegation visits from Israel that time, Jerusalem, and even from the DC talking about these relationships, where a lot of the stuff, I mean, there was, huge, bilateral trade had already started, but we wouldn't ever talk about it. That, of course, has changed. Now there is a much more overt acceptance, recognition, and a mutual respect for each other, which is there, for everyone you see. So in that context, do you see that, do you think that our relation, India's and Israel relation, is going to be closer? Do you feel that there'll be, now that there's a kind of a platform support, more to say? Earlier it was a kind of working in silos. Now that the other Gulf countries are coming forward, everybody, and as you pointed out that, I think there's a recognition that having isolated Israel for so long didn't do anybody any good. So it's now to warm up, it's good to, so do you think India's relationship is also, increase, strengthen at this point of time? And you also, somebody's asked whether do you see a trilateral relationship emerging at this point of time? I mean, India's always had very good relations with UAE. And do you think that it's possible to support something like that?
I do. Well, weird sound there. I hope that was okay.
Yeah, no, that's fine.
You're talking about a trilateral India Gulf Israel relationship.
Yes, that's right.
I think that makes perfect sense. I mean, aside from just the natural sort of logistical kind of arrangement, it seems to be ideal. And I do believe that that there will be huge traffic between India and the Gulf. The UAE already being a major hub, transportation hub, transit point, and the short hop to India, and the possibility of cooperation in a whole range of technologies as well. I see more and more of that, absolutely. And the idea that that in some ways what India has gone through with Israel, where you have a range of investments and sort of technology sharing, and not only the agricultural, centers of excellence that Israel has set up in India, but the tourism potential, Indians in Israel, Israelis in India, and certainly the strategic cooperation. I can see, after years of a more quiet relationship, now becoming a more open relationship, certainly under Prime Minister Modi, in some ways being reflected in what the UAE may experience in other Arab states as well. Obviously, the countries are very different. I think that the openness of India, the democratic nature of India, is quite distinctive and not duplicated in the Gulf. But and I always feel when I'm in India, kind of a joy in this relationship and an embrace of the relationship and of the potential of the relationship in maybe in ways that I haven't yet seen in the Gulf. I hope to see down the road in the Gulf. But it is very clear that this is in the interests of all peoples and in the interest of regional security. In India and Israel don't have exactly the same strategic threats, but similar strategic threats. And they can certainly learn from each other and they can cooperate, and they do quite intensively. So I see that, and I see the possibility at some point down the road of joint military exercises and other things that I think all point to a very different and very much more positive future.
Thanks. There are a whole lot of questions. I'm not sure how much we can handle, but let me also ask you, somebody's asking about Israel's contact with Qatar. Given that Qatar is closing up Iran and Turkey, how do you think that kind of affects the equation between Israel and Qatar?
It's very interesting. Israel has had a relationship with Qatar, of course, over the years. It had a more overt relationship in the late 90s, as I said. Doha also announced in October of 2000 that they would be ending that relationship, but they didn't quite end it. It continued for a while, even after they purportedly closed the Israeli office in Doha. It really wasn't closed. It was just sort of temporarily suspended. But since then, since Israel actually physically did leave Doha, a relationship continued, and it continued in the form of Qatar offering assistance to the Palestinians in Gaza. And they have been a steady and a very important conduit for aid, humanitarian aid to Gaza. At the same time, they've also been playing games. They've also been supportive of Hamas. It's not unfamiliar habit of that country, unfortunately, to sometimes be on both sides of an issue, maybe for self-defensive purposes. I don't know. I probably shouldn't be speculating on an open mic like this. At any rate, that relationship does exist. It has been useful to both peoples, to both countries. Whether it will now evolve into something larger, understanding the sensitivities within the Gulf, the fracture within the GCC, I know that it's certainly understood by other Gulf states that Qatar does play this role. It does have this function that is important for Israel. I don't see that rift being solved, being healed anytime soon. Every time I've discussed this when I'm in the Gulf, I certainly get a sense from those on the Saudi side of this axis that they're in no hurry to resolve things with Qatar in a way that is less than what has been demanded of the Qataris, and the Qataris do not seem to be interested in yielding on these demands on Al Jazeera or on other aspects of the Saudi and Emirati and Bahraini and Egyptian demands. But I do believe that Israel can continue to have this relationship, and I do see the possibility that it could grow into full diplomatic relations. It would certainly be smart politics for the Qataris, which have, of course, their own special relationship with the United States, very substantial air base in Qatar, and an important political relationship for the United States, even though the U.S., maybe like Israel in the future, has relationships with both sides of this fracture. It's one typically does not group Qatar in the countries that could be next in line after the UAE, but I think that's a mistake. I think it is in that same category with other Arab states that have the potential of establishing a relationship with Israel.
Another friend wants to ask, he wants your opinion about the Saudi position and whether you see a likelihood of a revolt from the conservatives, or do you see that this move could actually catapult the clerics' influence to the new heights? How do you read that?
I had a little problem. I heard the question about the Saudi position, but I didn't hear the second part of that question.
whether there is a likelihood of a revolt from the conservatives, or do you see that the clerics' influence growing now?
The clerical influence in Saudi Arabia?
Yeah.
Um, I don't feel that Mohammed bin Salman has yet been able to completely overcome that influence, although he has clearly diminished it by arresting many hardline clerics, trying to establish a sort of a different uh, kind of architecture for the regime. Um, so it is possible, although it would be startling if it happened really soon, for the Saudis to go in the same direction. Clearly, there is contact. Everyone knows it's not on the front pages of the newspapers, but everyone understands that there is some contact between the Saudis and the Israelis. There does seem to be some intelligence cooperation and defense relationship under the table. How far that's likely to go is unclear. Um, I I believe, based on some of the comments that were made by Mohammed bin Salman when he was in New York a couple of years ago, that there is keen interest in the investment potential, the technology sharing potential between the Saudis and the Israelis. Um, it's not clear to me that they're ready to make that move just yet. Um, but these guys talk to each other in the Gulf. I don't know that they necessarily need a green light from Riyadh. I think that's sometimes the assumption. I'm not sure that's correct. But they certainly talk to each other, and they will not do things to deeply offend each other without a good reason. So I believe it's pretty much understood in the GCC that this is the direction of the future, and it's just a question of how quickly people want to move.
Thank you. Somebody wants to know about the deal and the suspension of the West Bank annexation. Is the UAE putting up a narrative that normalization of relation with Israel is a better way of dealing with the Palestinian issue?
Um, Look, I believe that annexation isn't going anywhere anytime soon. I believe that the Palestinians should listen to the states in the region where government officials are telling them you should find a way to negotiate with the Israelis, that the clock is ticking and it's not going to be easier for you. It is going to be very difficult for the Palestinians to establish a contiguous state in the West Bank, given the hundreds of thousands of Israelis who live in the West Bank. And it's going to be harder 10 years from now if there are more Israelis living in the West Bank than it is today. It would have been easier 10 years ago or 15 years ago when there were other opportunities for the Palestinians to sit down with the Israelis and negotiate, and they unfortunately missed those opportunities. And what I've heard from leaders across the region, in the Levant, in North Africa, in the Gulf, is that the Palestinians are not doing themselves any favors by not sitting at the table. And if they do sit at the table, they will have these Arab allies and, frankly, European friends and others looking over the shoulder of the negotiators and trying to help them make the best possible deal. But waiting is not helping. So I don't believe that normalization costs, rather, in any way compromises the possibility of moving forward. I think just the opposite. I think that normalization will allow for more Arab partners to help try to exert some influence on Israel in a negotiating process.
Thank you, because that also answers some of the other questions that people had, and you kind of elaborated in this particular, so I won't repeat them. Okay, so we have somebody who's asking about after the US elections, if Democrats win, they will resume JCPO, and if Trump wins, he will try some kind of a deal with Iran, especially in the wake of the impending implication of the Iran-China strategic partnership. For us in India, both Israel and Iran are strategically important. So, how do you see Israel?
Well, that's so interesting. I should send you, or maybe you can find online. I think Arjun, would be able to find it for you. A conversation that I conducted yesterday with the deputy special representative on Iran in the State Department. Brian Hook, who's the special representative, was traveling with Secretary Pompeo and was scheduled to be on our call, but he had to take off with the secretary. But Mac McInnes spoke about what the Trump administration might be able to accomplish if it wins a second term regarding a deal with Iran. Of course, you had President Trump say just 2 weeks ago when he announced the UAE-Israel deal that if he were reelected within 30 days, he'd be able to make a deal with Iran, that they're dying for a deal, he said. I'm not so sure about that. I'm not so sure that they're dying for the kind of deal that the Trump administration wants, and frankly, that we want, which is a deal that's not just a return to the JCPOA, but something much stiffer and wider and longer, permanent, actually, to forswear nuclear enrichment, to do something about the missile regime, obviously regional aggression as well. These are all parts of the puzzle that were not solved by the JCPOA and must be solved if we're going to try to move forward toward a more peaceful region. Whether it's possible that the Iranians will come back to the table if President Trump is reelected, rush back to the table if President Trump is reelected, I'm not so sure. I think they will have to make a calculation. I know they're hurting from the stiff economic sanctions. And that pain is not likely to be reduced anytime soon. It's more likely to be increased if the president wins re-election. So it may be that there will be an effort to so-called sue for peace, not a term that one likes to adopt. It's a little undignified sounding, but I do believe that the maximum pressure campaign is having an effect, of course, on the Iranians. If it's a President Biden beginning on January 20th of 2021, do I see the United States rushing back into the JCPOA? It's a little unclear. There's been kind of a fuzziness in how they've explained this. Yes, they would like to return to the JCPOA if Iran returns to compliance with JCPOA. That's been said. So clearly, the extra enrichment that's taken place, the extra stockpile that's been built up, something would have to be done about that. Otherwise, the United States, under a Biden administration, would not rejoin. That's not sufficient for some of us who are quite concerned about the threat that Iran continues to pose to its neighbors and to global security. And we've had many conversations with people around the vice president about the need to have something really stiffer than that. That it would be really important to capitalize on the conversations that were actually taking place before the U.S. withdrawal under President Trump, when Brian Hook was traveling around to the capitals of the E3 states, Britain and Germany and France, and talking with them about ways to build on the JCPOA and have something stiffer so that the U.S. would stay in the agreement. And then, of course, President Trump decided to get out anyway, even though it seemed as though they were making some real headway on some of the conditions that the United States had laid down. I would like to see a President Biden, if there is a President Biden, go back to that same concept of rejoining on the basis of an agreement that it won't just be the JCPOA. It'll be something broader and longer than existed in the 2015 agreement. But that's still an open question where a Biden administration would go. Clearly, there's a desire for diplomacy. I would hope that certain sanctions that were put in place would not just be summarily lifted. The Iranians are bad actors in that region, and they pose a real threat to the region. And things have changed in 5 years. They haven't become less of a threat. They've become more of a threat. And I think that's all going to have to be taken into consideration very seriously by a Biden administration, if there is a Biden administration.
In fact, your elaboration actually takes care of a couple of other questions on this. So I'm not going to ask you separately. I think you covered it very adequately. We have a colleague of yours who wants to also understand about the mega China-Iran deal, which will ensure or even a closer alliance between India, the GCC, and the US. Do you think something like that is likely to?
I have no problem saying a closer alliance with India. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, the China-Iran deal. Which will ensure,
Actually, if you check out this the conversation that I had yesterday with Matt McInnes, I asked him about the China-Iran deal as well. I think that's something of great concern to us, and I would imagine of great concern to India as well.
Absolutely.
I know that we haven't even talked about I want to be careful on how I phrase this, but there are concerns about China's intentions and ambitions across the region, and I know that they're an issue of great concern in New Delhi as well. So while we want to be able to cooperate with that great power in ways that are to the advantage of all the countries in the region, there are real concerns as well. And I know that the possibility of strategic partnership with Iran would upset the strategic environment in a way that India would have to take some measures, and Israel and other states and Gulf states would also have to kind of reorient some of their thinking.
Yeah, it's a critical point, I think, that we are all standing on just now. I think, it's there are too many uncertainties, both, I mean, as to what this is happening. Also, the pandemics opened up another Pandora in terms of how we deal with, in terms of the entire globalization context, the connectivity context. And, there's so many other layers that are being unfolded at this point of time. And I think for you especially, it must be a defining moment, the kind of policy advocacy that you've undertaken for so many decades. And I think a fruition of that, which you see a very positive way. And I think that's something that a joyous moment, and I think a personal sense of achievement for you as well as your agency. And I think that's something that all of us, and again, I know Kumar closely watches this, and I constantly try and see it through his view, and I appreciate all the points that you made. So I'm going to thank you for being here, and I'm going to hand over the proceedings to Kumar. This is his event, let him get ahead. Thank you.
I very much enjoyed this conversation. And by the way, I didn't say anything at all about COVID, but of course, I think we all understand that it's just one more reason why cooperation among like-minded states is so essential. And I know that India has a great deal to contribute to this, and has, and in Israel as well. And when America gets its act together, so will America.
Okay, certainly.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Sri Radha.